Okay. Go into the text and see where we were. We are nearly done with this one section that began with verse 10. Um, so let me start the slideshow and then we'll go back to the text as well and begin there with the next verse that we're on. Whoops, went too fast. So again, within the section dealing with conventional bodhicitta, and of course the obstacle to that, as we just meditated on, is the mind of self-centeredness, self-cherishing. And that's the majority of this text. It's one of the, again, Lojong texts, Mahayana mind training texts, that helps us to overcome that demon, the demon of self-centeredness, but then go on in the verses 103 through 116 to work with ultimate bodhicitta, the wisdom realizing emptiness that the bodhisattva cultivates, which overcomes the other demon of self-grasping. So this is a rather large section that deals with karmic cause and effect and the antidotes to these. Again, I don't need to necessarily review these, but I will just to get us back into the framework of what we're looking at. In this section, all the way through verse 45, which we're actually very close to. Last week we ended at verse 43, so we only really have two more verses that follow this outline. The first line will be, again, the specific result that we might be experiencing or might have experienced in the past or could even experience in the future. The second line is telling us that this is the wheel of sharp weapons coming back to us due to our past actions. And it's your karma. We have to own up to that. Line C will give us the specific cause for that specific result. And then line D gives us the specific remedy. And sometimes the remedies are a little more general, but usually they're pretty much on target with how do we counteract that result by changing our behavior. And of course, we also want to purify those negativities. We also want to practice Tong Len, as Geshe Japa Gyatso has been emphasizing in his verses. So let's go back into these last two that are in this section that have that outline that I just went through. And then there are three more verses that are sort of a summary of everything that preceded it. So whenever our own listening and explanations are accompanied by attachment or hatred, so this is saying whenever we're listening to the Dharma or explaining the Dharma to others, and we have these delusions arising, such as attachment, hatred, it's kind of hard to imagine how some of them might arise. Attachment certainly is much easier to see how it could arise when we are listening to the Dharma or explaining the Dharma, because we can often get attached to some sort of pride in terms of the view of ourselves and our own knowledge, wanting to acquire knowledge perhaps for some sort of worldly gain, what have you. So that you can see how some of those could play a role. A hatred maybe is a little bit harder to see, but perhaps, again, due to familiarity with hatred, it could creep into how you work with the Dharma. So, as I said earlier, line 2 of the verses is always saying it's the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. And in this case, for not having sincerely reflected upon the faults of the Maras. We're going to go into the Maras and talk about them a little bit. Again, it's usually sometimes translated as demons, but really only one of them is another being. Most of the Maras, these dangers that we have in our lives, are internal. They are the things that happen to us. So then the advice that's given is now we should examine adverse conditions and abandon them. Things that are adverse to our practice of the Dharma and what have you. So let's go to the text. And again, we've been working with my teacher, Geshe Japa Gyatso's commentary that he put together for this text. Just a very brief commentary on each of these stanzas. He says, page 17, when attachment and hatred are illustrated with respect to explaining and listening to the Dharma, for instance, it is as follows. Whenever while listening and explaining we are accompanied by attachment or hatred without applying their antidotes, such as that even at the time of explaining or listening we are motivated by the attachment, hatred, or competitiveness that thinks, for instance, since even this person is explaining the Dharma, I too will explain the Dharma. Maybe again, it's not to say that you wouldn't want to explain the Dharma. I hope that all of you, when someone else is explaining the Dharma, would love to explain it to other people. But if we do it with a mind of attachment, thinking, oh, we'd like to have that status, be renowned, get famous as a teacher, have all sorts of, gain that we would get from doing that teaching, receiving all kinds of offerings and what have you, generating that type of worldly attachment to learning to be a teacher or being a teacher, well, then we would have that present. But again, I think you can do it with regard to listening as well, where you're just listening with great attachment without necessarily even thinking you want to become a teacher. It's just that you want to use the Dharma perhaps to acquire pleasures of this life, you know, the attachment to this life is really part of the problem. It's what keeps us from even getting on the path. I'll be talking more about that actually in Sunday's class for TNL when we go through the 8 worldly concerns. So that's a form of attachment that we have that can really taint our Dharma practice. So the last little bit of advice here says, when you're having an instance like that, for example, think, in this life and previous rebirths, I did not sincerely think about the faults of the Maras that are explained in many texts, such as the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra and 8,000 verses. This is actually there are 3 texts that are renowned as the 3 mothers of perfection of wisdom, the 100,000 verses, the 25,000 verses, and the 8,000 verses. This is the shortest of those texts. But again, the Maras are talked about in a variety of these texts. But in particular, he says, the worst Mara in this context, as was explained before, is self-cherishing, is that mind, again, that can become so problematic for us. Therefore, through excellently examining the faults of the Maras in general, and in particular the faults of self-cherishing, which is the main adverse condition, I will strive to abandon them. So when we see that, these delusions are creeping into our Dharma practice, or, in this case, but it could be any time the delusions are arising for that matter, we can think, this is due to my own faults of self-cherishing, as well as the other afflictions and these maras, demons, these forces that are causing me to have the wrong states of mind when I'm trying to practice virtue. So I have to strive to abandon them. Then, as he says, usually we should meditate on taking and giving. And from now on, through examining the faults of self-cherishing, the main adverse condition, we should abandon it. So we have, here and there touched on the faults of self-cherishing. If you want a more extensive presentation of them, there's a wonderful little meditation in the back of Bodhisattva Attitude, the book by Lama Zopa Rinpoche that's based on teachings he gave in North Carolina in 2009. And there's a whole meditation on all the faults of self-cherishing, all the advantages, the benefits of cherishing others. But we really have to see again, and we have been seeing it through this text, how self-cherishing is playing such a key role in causing us to engage in non-virtue and thereby induce our own suffering experiences, our own wheel of sharp weapons that comes back to cause us pain and agony. And of course, it also is, as I pointed out in the meditation tonight, the biggest obstacle to us opening our hearts to others. And we have to replace, this is why, again, that technique that is firmly rooted in the Lojong tradition of equalizing and exchanging self and others means to exchange that way of looking at things. Right now, it's me, myself, and I up here, and everyone else kind of down here serving my needs, subservient to me. Well, we have to learn to at first equalize it, but then eventually take others to this apex, to this extreme, where we are always holding them as most precious. Whether it be one being or countless beings, we are always trying to think of them first and not place our own needs above them. And as I said in the meditation, this is actually how our own needs are met. This is the way to achieve enlightenment, is to replace the tendency to cherish self with cherishing others. So let's look at these Maras in a little more detail. I thought this was a good opportunity to go into these a little bit. They weren't in the commentary so much, even when Geshe Jumpa Gyatso went into his own commentary on this. He didn't go into the 4, but just emphasized again that it's primarily the self-cherishing mind, which would be among the afflictions, because it usually is an afflicted state. Again, there are those subtle forms of self-cherishing that those on the Hinayana path still have, but nonetheless, for most beings, it's together with the other afflictions. So the first one is the Mara of the aggregates, which is simply referring to this mind-body complex that we possess. Then the Mara of the Lord of Death, which is the mortality that we all have to deal with. It's not a being. It sounds like it's somebody, who's an actual being. But the Lord of Death, we saw earlier, remember, is Yama. And Yama is overcome by Yamantaka, the destroyer of the Lord of Death. So essentially, this is just the mortality that we all are under the control of. The third is the Mara of the afflictions, which, as we know, are all of those afflicted, deluded states of mind that are running the show way too often, that we need to be wary of, because they are great dangers for our well-being, cause us unbelievable suffering. The last one is the only one that is actually a being. It's called the Devaputra Mara, the son of the gods. There is this being that is, got some sort of higher status in terms of its actual existence, but nonetheless, because of some karma we have with that being, somebody who is reborn in that state of the gods and has some connection with us, they can cause us various problems. So let's look at each of these as they're described in commentary by Geshe-la. This was commentary for the Ornament of Clear Realizations, a text that we studied in the beginning of the master's program in Italy. The aggregates are called amara because the mere possession of them produces suffering, which harms us. While the aggregate of form is the actual Mara of the aggregates, all 5 aggregates can be considered the Mara of the aggregates. Again, whenever we use the word Mara, we're talking about like a demonic force, something that is destructive to our well-being. So this is, again, pointing out that while form, which is the first of the 5 aggregates, and it refers to our body, is the main one here in the Mara of the aggregates, we can include the other 4. The other 4 are all mental aggregates. So this is why we often talk about just the mind-body complex, because feeling, discrimination, these are 2 of our mental factors. All the other mental factors are included in compositional factors. And then the consciousness in which those mental factors arise is the last of these. All of these are various elements of our awareness, our mind. And so essentially we have aggregates that we appropriate whenever we come into an existence. We have a new body, and then we have even a consciousness that is conditioned to some degree by what body we have taken. So every time that we're embodied, and even when we're between embodiments in the intermediate state, we have some level of aggregates, some level of form, even if it's a very subtle state of form, and then some level of consciousness that is going along with that. So that is a form of suffering, because, as was pointed out in the previous, this passage, mere possession of these, just possessing aggregates, harms us. It produces suffering. And we experience most of that through the form, through our bodies, right? Because that's, the main way in which we receive pleasurable and painful experiences. Not that we can't have those as purely mental, but that's where a good share of all those experiences come from. But all of those are conditioned by the factors that lead us to appropriate those aggregates. So they become unsatisfactory, and they only lead to more and more suffering. Whoops, went the wrong way. Let's go on to the second of the Maras. The Lord of Death is called a Mara because the separation of our body and mind causes us suffering. And again, by mind, we mean the subtle level of mind that does go on to your next existence. The coarser levels of mind are left behind because they were, related to the form that we took and the existence that we had. But essentially, when the subtle level of mind separates from the body, that causes us suffering. Just having to separate from that form that we had grown so accustomed to, the existence that we had, and so on. So the Lord of Death, Yama, again, is simply referring to this separation of body and mind. Again, it's not a being, although it's depicted sometimes. It's that kind of wild-looking being that's holding the wheel of life with his claws and what have you, and his teeth. Anyway, that's one way that we suffer, again, just by having to be separated from whatever existence we have, that body. The afflictions are called amara because they cause a suffering of body and mind. Suffering in our body can be the result of mental unhappiness, which causes an imbalance in the 4 elements of our bodies and thus results in illness and so on. But we can say certainly, everything that we experience in our bodies and minds arises through the force of some level of affliction or delusion that has created this contaminated experience. whether it be something that is a result of mental unhappiness where we have kind of an imbalance in the body, as is mentioned here, or whether it simply be the ripening of karma that comes through our actions that arose together with our afflictions. That's where we often call them contaminated karma. They're at least contaminated with ignorance, if nothing else, and sometimes they're contaminated with more, with attachment, jealousy, pride, anger, and so on. So all the afflictions are Mara because of this. And so it's easy to see, I think, that the afflictions are a demonic force in our lives, something that we should be, again, very cautious of and recognize the danger of. The son of the gods refers specifically in Tibetan to Garabwangchuk, who is also known by the name the one who possesses 5 arrows, and is called the one without a body in some Hindu scriptures. So again, I don't really know the literal translation of Wangchuk. I think Wang usually means power or something, but I maybe Paimene knows, maybe not. One of the arrows of the son of the gods is said to make people intoxicated. Another one, second one, makes people faint. A third one makes people confused. A fourth one makes people paralyzed. And another one makes people proud, gives them pride. So you get shot with these arrows. Again, it's not to say that there's actually a physical arrow that you experience. It's like this energy that comes from that being that enters into your continuum that then causes these diluted states to arise. And again, we're not giving them some sort of power from their own side. You would have to have created some sort of karma to have this malevolent influence in your life, that sort of Mara or demon. Okay. So then he goes on, this is actually commentary on the verse that we have. This is from his Wheel of Sharp Weapons commentary. He says, however, the main Mara or demon in general is the afflictions. Why is this? Because the afflictions always harm us and never benefit us. Although we tend to think that they help us, in reality, they always harm us. I mean, there's really no good that comes out of the afflictions. You might be able to experience some good out of death if you have the right state of mind. You might even be able to get some good out of these aggregates if you use them well, maybe even out of the experience of the son of the gods, what have you. But with the afflictions, what good can ever come out of them? Now, again, in Tantra, we use the energy of the afflictions, but we don't actually use the afflictions themselves. It's a very fine point that in the tantric practice, we're simply using the energy that comes with them that moves us in a particular direction to harness that energy and use it in a beneficial way. But the afflictions never benefit us. They are the real enemy. Whoops. Where'd I go? Whoops. There. Where did I go? I jumped ahead. That was it. Oh, no, this is the final part. It says in this particular context, I guess this was the passage from Wheel of Sharp Weapons, the main or principal demon or Mara is self-cherishing. Because of this, we need to examine its faults and strive to abandon it. So again, self-cherishing itself, we can't say is absolutely an affliction, because at the level of those, we discussed this way back at the beginning, and I mentioned it even earlier tonight, those who are on the Hinayana path, or even who achieve the result of the Hinayana path, which is the result of a foe destroyer, an arhat. If they achieve that, they've been guided to some degree by some small, subtle level of self-cherishing that is concerned about individual liberation, self-liberation, their own welfare. It's been blind to the suffering of other beings to some degree. I mean, they do have compassion, they do have loving kindness to great degrees, but they don't think about dedicating themselves to the welfare of those beings. Rather, they are guided by some, again, subtle level of self-cherishing. At that point, that can't be an affliction, because those beings have abandoned the afflictions if they've completed the Hinayana path. So again, self-cherishing in general, though, is an afflictive state for most beings, because it's arising together with self-grasping, again, these twin demons, and it's more often arising also with some of the other afflictions. It's arising with attachment, because when we have that self-cherishing mind there, grasping at things is inherently existent, and then we want something for ourselves to satisfy ourselves. We can see how attachment, comes along for the ride, but it's the mind of self-cherishing that is the real demon that on the Mahayana path we want to obliterate, because we don't even want that subtle level of self-cherishing there that the Hinayana practitioners have. So, Pamela said not at all. You probably haven't studied enough Tibetan to know it, and I don't know it, so there's a lot of Tibetan I don't know. I'm very ignorant of that. Laura, did you have a question?
Yes, what are the four elements in the body?
Oh, sure. The four elements are the four physical elements of earth, air, fire, and water.
Yeah, that's what I
And they do play each kind of their own role in the body. You know, producing like wind, air produces movement, earth is like a supporting thing, water coheses things, brings them together, and then fire produces the warmth in the body. So that's when those are talked about as the elements in the body. Everything that exists that is physical is some sort of combination of those four elements. And we see them being more predominant in the stuff we actually call earth, for example, or water. You might have one that's more predominant, but it doesn't mean the others aren't there. It just means that they're in much, much smaller sort of quantities than what we would have as the main substance that is manifesting. So, okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's other ways of talking about things in the body. Of course, in Tibetan medicine, they talk about the three sort of things of wind, bile, and phlegm. These three kind of get out of balance sometimes in the body. And that's kind of a different thing, a different teaching, a different way of approaching working with these things in the body. So let's go to our text. We're getting into the next verse, verse 45. This is the last of these that deals with this pattern of working with something that has happened. Where is it coming from? And what do we do about it? So whenever all the good we do turns bad, kind of everything goes sour, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having failed to repay all the kindness we received. Now we should accept great kindness with reverence. So, motivated by a benevolent attitude toward others, however much good we do, all of it turns bad. For example, when even the abbot of a monastery and others give advice and scold the assembly of monks out of affection for them, but they resentfully say, "He said this and that to me." Like they get upset and angry even when you're trying to help them. And there's backstabbing and so forth. This is a good deed turned bad. Like when all of your kind of virtuous things that you set out to do, everything goes sour. It just doesn't seem to happen in a way that is proper and good for everyone involved. Well, why is that happening to you? Why are your good deeds and the ways that you're trying to do things to benefit others not resulting in that? So think, this is due to failing to repay others for the kindness I received in the past. Kind of makes sense again when you talk about kindness. We are on the receiving end of so much kindness. In fact, what I'm going to do for this week is send out some points on meditating on the kindness of others. And I won't go through that tonight. I'll send that along to John, and that will go out with Sarah's email. But it's kind of something I put together that shows how no matter who it is, whether they're a friend, enemy, or stranger, we can see their kindness in some way. Well, we need to be cognizant of that kindness and want to repay it and do what we can to repay it. That's again one of the main parts of developing bodhicitta with the other technique, the technique of the sevenfold cause and effect. As we see all sentient beings as having been our mother, we remember the kindness they showed us, and then we want to repay that kindness. But we don't have to just think in that way about when they were our mother. We can think about the incredible kindness that others show us day in and day out. So then it says in the next line, moreover, this refers not just to my parents, because your parents have, for most of us, have been a major part of benefiting us, especially at a time when we were quite fragile, but also to all the people who benefited me out of affection, and to not only them, but also all the sentient beings who simply have the kindness of my mother. Again, we can think of the other ways that they're kind in this life, the ones that we have some connection with on this planet, in this world, this existence. But, every being has been our mother in one lifetime or another. Again, that's a whole nother way of looking at the kindness of others by thinking about those instances. But sometimes it's useful also just to think about the kindness of others right now that we've experienced in this life and continue to experience. So, this then is the bad actions turning against me, of failing to repay all their kindness by inflicting harm on them and so forth, motivated by the thought cherishing myself. Because again, the self-cherishing mind is going to be there when we do harm others, steal from them, belittle them, lie to them, and so on. Okay, so meditate on taking and giving, as usual, he adds that. And from now on, we should respectfully venerate without the slightest disrespect, wrong view, and so forth, those who are motivated by a benevolent attitude and affection for us. That is, those who possess the kindness of benefiting us in accordance with the Dharma, whether they are gentle or rough, whatever their demeanor is, don't let that become a stopping point for opening your heart to them. Even if they're like the abbot who might scold the assembly of monks out of affection, that might appear a bit rough to us, but we have to see the ways that they're trying to benefit us. Even our worst adversaries, enemies, can be incredible teachers for us, right? That's one way that we can even see those people in that camp as actually being very kind to us. It just depends upon our own minds and how we're going to look at things, right? Because if we look at things in a particular way, we'll have that results of that view. If we look at them in a different way, we'll have the results of that perspective. So let's go to the slides. I do have just a couple things to share on this. Again, verse 45. And this was something that I found really kind of interesting in Venerable Thupten Chodron's commentary on this text, Good Karma. She says, in Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, one meditation to help us cultivate bodhicitta involves considering our relationships with different people, parents, teachers, older and younger siblings, managers, colleagues, employees, and children. This is a meditation you could do as well. There's no problem with doing this. I just thought I'd throw out the other meditation as well. But with each, we contemplate how they have helped us, our responsibility toward them, and how we treated them. And that's, of course, the key of this. Kind of helps you to recognize the harm that we might have engaged in, towards others, even though they've benefited us. And we can clearly delineate how they benefited us. So this meditation, she says, is very humbling because we often discover that others have benefited us, but we have responded in inappropriate, ungrateful, or even negligent ways. We have accepted their affection, care, and kindness without any thought of helping them in return. The remedy is, as we saw in the verse, to respectfully repay others' kindness, to do what we can to see every sentient being as having been very kind to us, as having helped us. There's this verse in the 7-point mind training that is called be grateful to everyone, I think is the actual line, but sometimes it's worded a little bit differently. But the idea is that how do we develop that sense of gratitude? By seeing the kindness that they've shown us, the ways that they benefited us. As I said, even our worst enemy can be an incredible boon to our practice. Remember Lama Atisha, who is again the person who potentially brought these teachings into Tibet from his teacher Dhammarakshita. When he it's they said that when he went from India to Tibet, making that long journey up to the high plateau of Tibet, he brought along this Bengali tea boy who he would practice patience with because this guy apparently had some really annoying habits to him or something. And so he actually decided to bring somebody with him who could help him maintain his patience and his, compassion and care and concern in the midst of, all of what was going on. And so, and part of the reason, just as a footnote to this, part of the reason why he said he did that is because he didn't know what the Tibetan people were like, and he imagined that they were all very smooth, gentle. They wouldn't be annoying him at all. So he wanted to make sure he had somebody who played that role, so he could keep up his practice of patience. But the story is that once he got to Tibet, he realized that wasn't the case, and he actually didn't need to bring along the Bengali tea boy because there were plenty of difficult people that he met when he was in Tibet. So, but anyway, know that, I mean, how often do we invite in that, people who are difficult for us and think, oh, I really want to spend time around them because it'll help me to be more patient and kind and tolerant. Of course, what often happens too is that they start becoming a little softer because they're around us and we're manifesting a softer edge to ourselves. So there's great benefit sometimes for both parties. Not that that should be the measure. I shouldn't want to be around them so I can change them. We want to ideally hold the view that we will ultimately be able to change them. But whether it happens in the moment or not, there are many other factors involved in that, obviously. So now we've completed the first set of verses up through 45 that all have that pattern. The last three verses of this section, 46 through 48, are more summary in nature, giving general advice on our practice. So let's go on to the next verse. Verse 46, in short, the undesirable that is encountered is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us, just like a smith slain by his own sword. So, a blacksmith who is producing a sword ends up getting killed by the very sword that he produced. It's kind of it sounds like a movie ending or something, where somebody creates a weapon and then is finally killed by the weapon that they created. And that's what's happening to us all the time when we experience these negative things. They're not necessarily being killed, but we're always being damaged in some way by what we have created. Now we should be conscientious in regard to negative actions. So yeah, let me go ahead and go through the verses. I think or the slides that I had for this. This is from a teacher, Samlo Geshe Kelsang Gyatso, who was a resident teacher, resident Geshe, at Losang Dorkpa Center, I think in Malaysia. And many years ago, he taught on this text, and this is from his commentary. He says, what do we have to do so as not to encounter these sufferings of not meeting what one wishes? Which is, again, everything we've been looking at, all the sorts of suffering we have to experience that we really don't want. Well, from now on, we have to be very conscious or very careful in the practice of Dharma and the karma of negative actions. We have to stop creating those swords by which we will be slain. When we create negative actions, at that very moment, we have to know that the results of these actions will cause sufferings for ourselves in the future. That's the cognizance that we're trying to generate continually by our study of karma, and especially our study of this text, is that we will have to experience the results of these. Everything that we are doing, we are creating future results. Every moment of your mind, every speech that you, word of speech that you utter, every action that you take physically, every one of those create karma that will cause either suffering or pleasant experiences for you in the future. Here we're looking at the sufferings because we want to get very clear about what is causing us to have problems, and then how can we correct that as well as connect to the suffering of others. So knowing that, he says, we should now refrain from these negative actions. Be conscious of this. He used conscious, maybe he was meaning again conscientious. But if you don't put effort in this and you know it, it will be worse when you still commit the negative actions, right? If you've been told not to do something that it will cause suffering, and you have some conviction in that, but you keep doing it, well, the consequences even get worse because it's like you're going against the advice that you're being given. Um, I don't know. Again, I wouldn't, put a big guilt trip on us if we're not yet capable of changing our actions. We have to just keep working in that direction. But do your best to overcome these, having seen that they are the cause of your future suffering. Because he says, otherwise it becomes recklessness. For that reason, one should be conscious of these negative actions and try to refrain from doing them. Um, Let me stop here and go to Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary, and then there's a little bit of his commentary on his commentary. Again, this is the written commentary that he did for this text. In regard to verse 46, he says, having indicated by means of the above verses the majority of actions that occurred in the past, now this verse indicates the way in which the undesirable arises due to conditions that expand in this life. This is one of the natures of karma, right? It expands, it multiplies and increases, and eventually brings forth its fruit in this life in terms of what we experience, or it could even bring forth fruit in future lives. But therefore, with respect to this, encountering suffering in this life, what is desired not occurring, the undesirable occurring, and so on, not getting what we want, essentially having suffering experiences, is simply the sharp weapons turning against us of bad actions done and accumulated in previous rebirths, just like a smith who is slain by the very sword that he so elegantly, or I'm sorry, excellently forged. I guess elegantly would be appropriate too. People would put a lot of attention into creating a sword that is a weapon, that is something that can cut, that can harm. And when that comes back around to harm us, well, then we created it. So again, that's the implication behind this analogy of the smith. Since it is impossible for the result of bad actions done by others to ever ripen upon us, think that such is the result of our own bad actions, and meditate on Tonglen, taking and giving. From now on, we should be conscientious in all ways without ever engaging in negative, non-virtuous actions. Negative or non-virtuous actions. Again, I think they're kind of mutually inclusive. So let's go back to the slides. Again, this is Geshe Gyatso's commentary on what he wrote. He said, we should examine what we have done in this life, for example, what we did last year, the year before, and so on, going back in time for as long as we can remember. If we find that we did good actions, we should rejoice in them. Of course, this wasn't in his written commentary, but this is another aspect of it is don't just, pick yourself apart to death at looking at all the negative. When you are examining your past or even the present at the end of each day, looking at, what you did that day, well, then rejoice in what you did that was virtuous, that was good. Then he says, and if we find that we did bad actions, again, negative actions, non-virtuous actions, we should regret them and resolve not to do them again. Then we should meditate on taking and giving. So he's speaking here in part to the application of the four opponent powers by regretting them, resolving not to do them again. We should also engage in some form of an antidote, and that antidote can be taking and giving meditation. Remember, anything can be an antidote. We spoke about those four opponent powers. They're going to appear again in a slide coming up. I don't know if we'll get to it tonight or not, but they're referred to in a verse coming up, these four powers. But recall that, again, this is how we deal with our negative karma in part, is purify what we have done, but then make the commitment to stop doing it, to resolve not to engage in those actions. That's one of the most important of the four powers, because that's the way that we actually change our behavior and change our minds by virtue of that. So this is the next verse. The dukkha again is that word that we've seen before, is the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, often translated as suffering, but the dukkha experienced in the bad migrations being the hell realms, the hungry ghost realms, the animal realms, is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us, like an arrow maker killed by his own arrow. I think the word that's used for an arrow maker is a fletcher. I think I'm correct in that. A fletcher who's killed by their own arrow. So it's a similar analogy to the sword, right? You have the smith who makes the sword and is killed by the sword that they made, and then here we have a fletcher who's killed by the arrow that they made. So now we should be conscientious with regard to negative actions. Kind of, again, a repetition of that idea of having some conscientiousness, being very dedicated to being attentive to what's going on in our minds and our behavior, and trying to engage in virtue as much as possible and avoid non-virtue. Otherwise, we'll end up in the bad migrations. Recall that that is one of the results of a complete action, what's often called, again, the fruitional or ripened result of a rebirth in an unfortunate state. If you've committed a non-virtuous action that is complete, that has all of the limbs present, and so on. Again, I've talked about those earlier, I believe, but if not, most of you know that from your Lam Rim teachings. Then it creates a karma to be reborn in one of these bad migrations. So I did want to point out, and I should have actually put this, in the other section, because conscientiousness was mentioned there too. But conscientiousness is a distinct mental factor. It's actually one of the virtuous mental factors that cherishes the accumulation of what is wholesome and guards the mind against that which gives rise to afflictions. It's kind of a very powerful part of our minds that can be, again, very virtuous, because it keeps us on that track of engaging in what is wholesome. And it doesn't allow non-virtue to arise, the afflictions to arise. Okay. Then let me go to Geshe-la's commentary, again, toggling back and forth between each of these. So let me scroll down here to the next page. This is page 19, I think, or 21. I can't remember, 19, I think. Think the various dukkha or suffering experienced even in previous rebirths in the abodes of the bad migrations, as well as all the suffering that I have yet to experience due to the force of my bad actions. So whether we talk about those of the past or those of the future, all of those are the sharp weapons of the bad actions turning against me, of having accumulated many negative actions, just like an arrow maker, a Fletcher, killed by their own arrow. Then meditate on taking and giving, and think from now on, by possessing conscientiousness, we should abandon the negative non-virtuous actions that bring rebirth in the bad migrations. So again, these are just real general ways of talking about avoiding those, creating those wheels of sharp weapons that we have to experience, that we end up getting cut by. Let's go to a little bit more commentary that talks a little bit about this idea of the sword and the arrow. In his commentary, this is from Geshe Ngawang Dargye's commentary, is like commentary upon commentary, but he refers to somebody named Tenpa Rabge, who no, it should be notes. I don't know why it says nose. In his commentary, Tenpa Rabge notes that most of the analogies to weapons in this text concern implements, such as bows and arrows, swords, and so on. You know, we do notice a lot of weapons, right? There's this whole idea of the wheel of sharp weapons, which, as I mentioned, is like this weapon that Indra has that he sort of sends out to cut all of his enemies down and come back to him like a boomerang. But you know, there's a lot of it's pretty severe weaponry in this text and in some of the other Indian texts as well. The sword, he goes on to say, symbolizes ultimate bodhicitta. Ultimate bodhicitta is the realization of emptiness directly, non-conceptually, in the mind of a bodhisattva. It is when your bodhicitta, which is your aspiration to become a Buddha, is united with that realization of emptiness. For just as the sword kills by cutting, so too does ultimate bodhicitta sever the root of psychic existence, that is, our self-grasping, our grasping at things as inherently existent. So this is that idea of the sword of wisdom, the wisdom realizing emptiness, the perfection of wisdom that cuts through. Again, and when it's in the mind of that bodhisattva, it is considered ultimate bodhicitta. And then he says, moreover, just as the spear or the arrow pierces, so too does the relative or conventional bodhicitta and destroys the self-cherishing attitude. It pierces and destroys the self-cherishing attitude. It kind of gets at the heart of it, the way that we are looking at ourselves as most superior, neglecting the welfare of others, and it destroys it. You know, it annihilates it, and of course replaces it with the mind cherishing others. So conventional bodhicitta here is the arrow in this analogy, and then the ultimate bodhicitta is the spear. Now, I haven't really fully contemplated like how that relates back to the two verses. I mean, but again, the idea is that we have to see again that this is maybe another way of looking at it, to see that we have to develop our own spear, which is not the spear that we get, you know, killed by later, like the smith that's slain by their own, I'm sorry, sword. We have to develop our own sword. That's the sword of wisdom that will cut through all of this, rather than the sword that the smith makes that ends up causing us suffering. So you kind of can use it as that kind of a mirror analogy. So over here in the second verse that we looked at, you have the arrow that the Fletcher makes that they end up getting killed by. But here we can produce the arrow of bodhicitta that kills the mind of self-cherishing, and by virtue of that helps us to attain Buddhahood. Just as that sword of wisdom will kill our self-grasping and help us to go on the same path. All right, so we have one more verse that pertains to this. Let me go to here. To once again encounter the sufferings of the laity is the sharp weapons of negative actions turning against us, like parents murdered by the son that they raised. Now it is fitting to always take ordination. Now, this is a verse that does require a little bit of commentary, because we might look at it and go, well, wow, he seems like, you know, he's just really putting down the life of a layperson. And to some degree, there's some truth to that, because lay people do have a lot of other sufferings and difficulties. But, you know, the idea of taking ordination can also be seen in some other ways, and we'll look at that in a moment. Yeah, let me come back to these, because there are some interesting comments that I'm sharing that I think will elucidate this a little bit more. But we have to start with what Geshe Jampa Gyatso says in his commentary. He says, previously, in the verses above, the faults of self-cherishing were said to be many. Since all of these faults have been Oh, wait, no. I think we went too far. Okay, here. Yeah, this is it. Sorry about that. Okay, so erase that. Whenever we encounter the suffering of meeting enemies, not being able to keep our wife at home or partner at home, maybe to be less gender specific, and so forth, reflect upon this thinking, for example, that it is like parents who raise their only child with kindness from the time they were little. But due to their coming under the power of the afflictions, their anger blazed up even at a mere slight mention of what they wanted or did not want with regard to a situation. And forgetting their parents' past kindness, they ended up harming them, or even worse, took their lives. So when such events happen, think this is the sharp weapons turning against me of the negative actions that were committed under the power of self cherishing in previous rebirths that entailed failing to repay others for their kindness. It's very similar to what we saw a while ago, right, about failing to repay kindness. So the analogy that's used there is if you had a child who was raised by parents very uh, uh, attentively, caringly, but ended up turning their back on their parents and even going so far as to harm them, to kill them. Well, that's what we've done to so many other sentient beings in a similar way. They've taken good care of us in maybe not necessarily this life, but other lifetimes as our dear mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, grandparents, whoever. And we've harmed them in turn, for what they have done to benefit us. So he says, then meditate on taking and giving. From now on, we should enact the completely pure Dharma through always completely emerging, that is, definitely emerging from the dwellings of the laity. In other words, through always taking ordination. So there is this kind of meaning that is involved here that has to do with the laity being what they are often called householders. Householders being those who have decided to live the lay life, like everyone who's in the Gompa room here tonight, who isn't ordained as a monk or a nun, who hasn't made that deeper commitment to living with a greater number of vows. The ordination vows are quite numerous if you take full ordination. But nonetheless, there's also this idea of laity simply referring to the trappings of being a lay person. There are trappings also for the ordained. Don't get me wrong. It's not like they, just by virtue of putting on robes, you're instantly free of all of the difficulties that you experienced as a layperson. But nonetheless, know that there is some real difference in terms of the commitment that is being made for those who take ordination versus those who don't. But the idea here too is though is that ordination can refer to any level of vows that we take. And the idea of being a laity would be somebody who, again, is not going to take those vows or who's going to not uphold those vows. And we want to be very clear that any vows that we take, whether it be just at the level of the 5 lay vows, or it be at the level of full ordination as a monk or nun, or whether it be the bodhisattva vows or the tantric vows, that we want to kind of engage in them wholeheartedly. We want to have that dedication to our practice and not in any way neglect it. So let me share some other passages that give more credence to that kind of an idea rather than thinking, oh, well, this is meaning that my life as a layperson is only suffering and that I need to, become a monk or a nun and thereby, end all of my grosser forms of suffering. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's usually not. There are 2 traps, Geshe Ngawang Dargye says. Monks and nuns are caught in the lesser trap of having to work in the administration of monasteries and so on. Of course, this happens in the FPMT, right? You have a lot of monks and nuns that are frequently involved in running centers and doing projects for Rinpoche and what have you. And you can end up spending a lot of time and energy on those projects. It's good work to do. Don't get me wrong. It's very beneficial to fulfill Rinpoche's wishes, to aid the monasteries, nunneries, to be able to function, to do what they do. Lay people are caught in the greater of these traps, which is having to care for a family and attendants and pets and houses and cars and so many other things. But again, it's not to say that everyone who's a monastic doesn't have those same problems. And there might even be some people who are lay who don't have a family, don't have attendants, don't have children, don't have pets, don't have a house, who might be actually in a more ideal position than some of the monastics. So again, this was just him pointing out that you could say that there are these 2 traps that either one would get into if we talk about simply ordained people, practitioners, versus those who are lay householders. The remedy to this, Venerable Tipton Chodron says, is to renounce worldly life. This could mean renouncing mundane life and taking monastic ordination, she says, which is often called leaving the householder life and entering the homeless life, because at that point you should ideally not be attached to having a home at all, because that's again one of the trappings that you're moving away from, no longer being a householder, but instead putting your confidence in the Dharma and attending to things in a very different way. Not continuing to have a regular daytime job and have a house that you pay a mortgage on and whatever. But then she goes on to say, or it could mean that your mind, no matter if you are a lay practitioner or a monastic, relinquishes the attachments of a householder to family, money, possessions, job, house, and so forth, and turns toward nirvana. So I think this is important to emphasize, is that what does it mean to be a householder, a lay person versus an ordained person? It can involve vows, and as I said, it can involve upholding the vows that you possess, but it can also simply mean I'm going to turn away from the trappings of a lay life and not get involved in the trappings of an ordained, but rather try to be free of all of them as much as possible, to dedicate my life to the practice of Dharma. To turn my mind towards nirvana, whether it be the nirvana that's a self-liberation, or especially in this context, the nirvana that is non-abiding nirvana, the state of Buddhahood. Whoops, I keep hitting the wrong up or down key. Instead of focusing on the happiness of this life or even a good rebirth in psychic existence, you aspire then for liberation or full awakening. That's kind of what it means to be removed from the concerns of a householder. Stop being so preoccupied with all of the things, the matters, the affairs of household life, and turn your mind towards the Dharma more fully. And then there's another commentary again by Samlo Geshe Khalsang Gyatso, who I mentioned earlier. He says, in answer to a question that had to do with about living purely in the vows, he says, living purely means observing the vows purely. There are two kinds of vows, layperson vows and ordination vows. He's talking more strictly within the what are called pratimoksha, self-liberation, individual liberation vows. Ordination vows are much better and stronger than layperson vows. So he's kind of giving some weight to that original interpretation of this, that it is good ideally if you can leave behind the householder life and take on robes and become a monk or nun. So if you receive ordination vows and keep them purely, you refrain from committing all those actions like the negative actions of a lay or family life. Why? Because you aren't engaged in that ideally. If you do take on the role of a monk or a nun, you should ideally be in community with other monks and nuns and living a life that is detached from a lot of the things that lay people can get caught up in, right? And a lot of negative actions do ensue by being involved in family life and what have you. On the other hand, a layperson or family may keep their lay vows purely, but they still commit negative actions as a result of living a lay or family life. As a result, ordination vows are more important to keep than a layperson's. But nonetheless, if you do, and I'm guessing most of you won't become ordained anytime quickly, but nonetheless, you may aspire to that at some point. But recognize that even as a layperson, we do have vows that we can uphold, and we do have ways that we can make our lives much more meaningful by detaching from so many of our lay concerns, and in that way not experience the sufferings that come from lay life. Which again, going back to the verse, it was saying when these things happen, when we have sufferings of the laity, where we are experiencing relationship problems and financial problems and all these various things, recognize that this is once more due to us not having appreciated the kindness of others. And we need to be attentive to that and try to hold whatever vows or whatever level of ordination, whether it be strict ordination by vows or whether it be just ordaining oneself through the mind of renunciation and the mind of bodhicitta and wanting to become liberated or enlightened, whatever, we're doing with our lives that's more meaningful, be fully dedicated to that, rather than engaging in all of the trappings of a lay life. All right, so it's 7:07. Let's call it 7:08. So at 18 after, we'll reconvene and we'll go into the next section of this text.